Hey creeps, it's Horror Free For All. Continuing my series I like to call Discovering Anthology, a series where I look at horror anthology films, either for the first time or however many times that I've seen the film in question, and I just go over my thoughts on the movie, the segments in question, and perhaps their overall lasting impact on the subgenre as a whole. A subgenre that, in my opinion, is my absolute favorite within horror. For today's video, we're going to be looking at a film from 1989. It was written and directed by Ken and Jim Wheat, a duo that was responsible for writing A Nightmare on Elm Street 4 and The Fly 2, which, in my opinion, are two underrated horror movies. The film in question is After Midnight. Now, After Midnight was put on my radar semi-recently. I had heard about the film over the past few years, and I just never got around to watching it. But recently, I decided to finally put it on streaming and check it out. And after watching it, I have to say that I have mixed feelings on it. And I'm going to say this, After Midnight kind of falls into some other horror anthology films that I've already talked about in this series, and some that I will probably get to in the near future. And that is, they have this mystique of EC Comics going for them. Now, it's not quite schlocky like Creepshow, but it's more grounded in realism type stuff going on in this movie. Kind of like how the Tales from the Crypt HBO show was. And I'd be remiss to say that some of the segments in this movie do feel like they could fit into that show. But I don't know if it was writing. I don't know if this was studio meddling from the parent company that released the film, which in this case was MGM. I mean, this studio was responsible for movies like Killer Clowns from Outer Space, Bubba Hotep, Life Force, Jeepers Creepers, and so many other films that I have a soft spot for. So, yeah, I couldn't tell you what happened with this film. Maybe they just didn't have the budget to pull off everything they wanted to in the segments. Maybe they had to axe out a lot from these segments to fit a runtime. Or maybe, just maybe, the script had doomed this movie from the start. I couldn't tell you. But whatever it is, I think that's the source of my disappointment. But we have a movie to discuss, and let's go ahead and talk about this film. This movie starts off with two girls in college, and they are, I guess, roommates or best friends, and they have signed up to do this psychology of fear course with this brand new professor that they have never heard of. And when they enter the class and they're with their peers, there's this one guy up front in the class that seems to be a spectator to this professor that walks into the room. And the professor uses him as an example to the rest of the class to kind of show his approach on fear and what that entails. And because of this, there's something that happens with him and this gentleman in the front of the classroom that involves a gun. And once this event transpires, which may or may not involve the guy pissing himself and running out of the classroom, the professor then amps it up even more, turns the gun onto his chin and pulls the trigger. And let's just say it seems like he just offed himself. Well, as the class onlooks in horror, the professor reveals that it's a joke. And the professor openly invites the students, if they wish, to come to his house later that night around midnight so they can possibly swap stories and get a sense of what's scary and fearful. And this may or may not play a role in a future lesson that can impact their grade. So once class is over, the students are congregated out in the courtyard of the campus, and they're talking about the opportunity to go to the professor's house. And some students are apprehensive and some are excited to go. And the brunette girl in this duo of friends thinks it's a good idea to go, but the blonde girl seems apprehensive because she thinks something is off, and we learn possibly what that means later on in the movie. Well, the two girls decide to join up with some other students and actually go to the professor's house. And when they get there, they're greeted by the professor and invited inside, and they're taken to a room in his home where he has set them up kind of like in like a circle so they can essentially tell campfire stories just without a campfire. And the professor wants to start the story sharing time off with his own story. And this leads into the first real segment of the movie called The Old Dark House. Now, The Old Dark House is a short and sweet story, but it's about this couple who are out in this coastal highway, I guess on the east coast of the United States somewhere, and they're celebrating the husband's birthday at this nice restaurant. And after a nice dinner, the two of them don't want the night to end, but they also think that it could be fun to go, drive down the highway and get some fresh air and enjoy the coast while they're there. But unfortunately for them, as they're traveling down the highway, they come across some car trouble involving their tire. They have to come to an agreement to go to a stranger's house to possibly get some help. But the nearest house to the couple is this old mansion of sorts that is tied to a killer, supposedly. And as the story goes, the killer killed, I think, a few people in the past and is said to possibly haunt the place or still be lurking around. It's kind of vague. But the husband seems a bit freaked out, and the wife does as well, but they have no other options, and they think that the house might have something there that they could use. So they decide to go inside and investigate. Well, when they get inside, almost rather quickly, the husband and wife become separated. And the husband is doing his own perusing, and while he's doing so, he hears some weird noises and feels like somebody's watching him. And the paranoia grows and grows as he's venturing inside the home, and it builds up to a point where he thinks that he sees a man with shears in his hand, possibly stalking him. So he decides to grab a sword for self-defense. Now, when we get caught up to speed after the husband grabs the sword with the wife, there's a recontextualization with the wife and why she's in the house, and possibly all the events that led up to them being in this home was actually for something completely different. But the husband has no idea of the matter. And it builds up to the climax of the story where the husband, carrying the sword, feels like he needs to make a move of self-defense with this person that he thinks he's seeing, because he thinks he hears his wife screaming and figures he has to do something to help. But unfortunately for everyone involved, there's a tragic accident that the story weirdly just ends on that is completely morbid, but also rather sad. And once the story is over, the professor looks at his students to see their reactions. And they all seem rather impressed with the story, and they think it's rather creepy. And the professor decides to throw the gauntlet over to whoever else wants to go and share a story. And one, guy, I guess he's inconsequential to the story, volunteers to share his story. And the one he decides to share is called A Night on the Town. Now, this story is about 4 young college girls. I think they're pushing the age of 21, or some of them might be 21 and some might not be. And they're out in the warehouse district downtown in a urban city looking for some fun and trying to get some drinks at a bar. Well, the bouncer at the bar notices that a couple of the girls have some fake IDs that don't match up to a real one. So they realize they need to skedaddle because they obviously don't look old enough to, sneak into bars. So they have to go look for trouble elsewhere. But unfortunately for the girls, the car that they're riding in, which is like a red convertible, is running low on gas, and they need some help with the car once it starts acting up. So they stop at this service station, which they think could be operable, but upon investigating, they realize that it looks kind of disheveled and possibly closed. So 2 of the girls hop out of the car, to go look around the building, and they wander inside of it and discover that there's a man inside that might have some nefarious motives with them. And he essentially locks them in there, and he has these 3 vicious dogs on guard to kind of trap the girls in there. Now, when their friends don't come out of the building after a while, the other 2 girls go to help. And when they oversee that the man is possibly trying to, kidnap these other 2 girls, they decide to interfere, and something happens to the man in question. Well, once the girls try to escape the building and get back in their car and drive off, the man's 3 dogs take off after them. And for the rest of the segment, the girls with this car that's running low on gas and might be having some trouble have to figure out how far they can really go in this car and avoid these dogs. And through some various crashes and mishaps and damaging the car even further, they realize that they've kind of reached the end of a rope. And one of the girls has a complete panic attack and decides to leave the car on her own, and this may or may not backfire against her. And the other 3 realize that they're in deep shit and they have to come up with something quickly. And their answers are perhaps given to them when they find this building that has flammable liquid in barrels inside of it. And let's just say they decide to make use of this building and said flammable liquid to take care of these dogs. And this may or may not pan out for them in the end result. Once this story is over, and after the guy is done sharing his story, the professor decides that it's time for another story. However, we get caught up to speed with another character we haven't seen since the beginning of the movie in the wraparound, which is the guy that was humiliated in front of his entire class. He has decided to come and crash this professor party of sorts, and he has made his station down in the basement of the professor's home, and he lies awaiting the gentleman. Well, before we get caught up to speed on this guy down in the basement, we hear one last story. And this time the story comes from the brunette girl, who is one of the 2 main girls of the story. And she shares her frightening tale, which is called All Night Operator. Now, this story is very simple to follow, and you've probably seen many stories like it in the past. This story involves a phone operator who has a bum leg and is on crutches due to an injury, and she's decided to come cover a shift for her fellow colleague one night because she wants a night off to go, have a nice dinner with her lover and go out on a nice date. But before her shift starts, her colleague tells her that on this specific night every week when she's usually working, there's this weird creep guy that calls. And she gets the weird vibes from him, and she warns the girl that if this guy calls, don't tell him anything, don't tell him where I'm at, because I'm starting to get kind of fearful of this man. Well, once her shift starts and she's getting, a little bit into it, she, of course, gets the operator call from a phone booth. And when she picks it up, it's the man. And the man is, of course, looking for her colleague, and she's like, she's not here. I can take a message for you, and I can personally give it to her. And the man's like, no, I'd rather talk to her personally. Me and her talk all the time, blah, 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 blah. And the girl seems mortified over on the other end, but she can't really do anything, and she doesn't really know exactly where this guy is. But we see that he's outside of her colleague's apartment complex, and he might be in knowledge of where she lives. Now, of course, the girl doesn't know that, but once the guy hangs up the phone, all she can do is let her friend know that this guy called. And once they're done with their conversation, the girl can't help but think that she should reach out to her other friend in the building and to the security officer to keep an eye out for a weird guy that might come up to the building. She just has that feeling it's going to happen. Well, once she does that, she gets another call from her colleague's apartment, and when she answers it, it's the man. And we figured out that he has perhaps done something to her colleague, and now the man wants to do something to her. And this freaks her out even more, and she becomes more increasingly paranoid, and she realizes that she is not safe by herself by any means and wants to get in the company of others. Well, by the time she musters up the courage to get out of whatever room she's in, and she makes a break for the elevator, she sees that something possibly has happened to her friend, and this mortifies her even more to panic and try to arm herself for self-defense. And this plays a heavy role in the climax when she thinks that she's been cornered by this man, and she decides to put up a fight, and we see a tragic result become of that, of something she didn't intend to do. And there's a twist involved at the end that insinuates that this entire ordeal may not be over. And once this story wraps up, all the fellow students are, at this point, really jonesed that the students have some creepy stories and they want to hear more. And the professor wants to hear a story that the blonde girl seems to want to confess. But before he can hear it, he needs to go down to the basement and turn on the heat, because at this point of the night, I think the power's implied to have gone off or maybe shut off, and he wants to turn on the gas furnace. Well, when he goes down to his basement, he of course meets the gentleman who he embarrassed in front of his peers in class earlier that day. And he's down there armed with a weapon of an axe, and he wants to do some damage to this professor. There's a commotion brought upon down there that invites the students to come down and investigate. And there's this whole thing about the student trying to get revenge on the professor that takes place, and an absolutely chaotic sequence of events that kind of defy logic. But the blonde girl ends up being the only person to get out of the basement. But when she gets out, she realizes that whatever she stumbled into has now become a paradox of sorts, of different landscapes and locations that were possibly hinted at in the segments that we just got done, watching. And this plays a role at the end of the story after she has a harrowing encounter with a monster with an axe, let's just say. And this completely recontextualizes the entire film, and it goes all the way back to the beginning, and it goes back to one of the earliest conversations between the brunette girl and the blonde girl early on that insinuates that whatever that the blonde girl just went through throughout the whole movie was perhaps a premonition or something like that, and that's as far as I'm going to go with that. Now I'm going to say this off the bat about this film. If I can say the best quality that this movie has going for it is the sheer fact that it tries to be bold, but I feel like what ends up happening is it's bold in the wrong ways. I haven't seen an anthology movie put so much focus on the wraparound segments before until I've seen this. And I can say that I can mildly appreciate the big swing here. I think that the guy who plays the professor, Edward Derrick, that's not the actor's name, that's the character's name. I thought he was a scene chewer. And I do think that the setup of having a professor who teaches a psychology of fear course and inviting his students to come share scary stories is a relatively cool concept. And I think for the most part, it did kind of work in the movie. But where I think that this film kind of dropped the ball is the build-up and payoff by the end of it. Yeah, you have the whole revenge motif with the scorned student trying to get back at the professor for humiliating him. But then again, I also feel like it's very extreme, and I also think that it's very ridiculous in how that's handled. And I'm not even talking about the fucking wacky shit that comes out of nowhere in the end of the movie. But with that aside, everything else I can appreciate about the wraparound. And I'm going to say this now. The segments, while there's nothing really great here or something groundbreaking in the horror anthology subgenre or something completely endlessly rewatchable out of here, I will say that all three of the segments, The Old Dark House, A Night on the Town, and All Night Operator, have a true EC Comics love letter idea going for them. Maybe not the second segment as much, but definitely the Old Dark House, and All Night Operator. But more specifically, the first segment, and I guess I'll go ahead and start sharing my thoughts on each individual segment here. I thought the Old Dark House personally was my favorite segment of the entire film. Yes, it's rather short. Yes, it ends on a punchline, but that's what EC Comics are known for. And this feels like something that would have been in Tales from the Crypt, I feel. Yes, it's kind of lame in some aspects of it. Yeah, you can see after a certain point, especially if you've seen segments from the beloved Tales from the Crypt television show, such as Three's a Crowd, the Old Dark House is a very similar play on that episode. And it's nowhere near as good. But I think it works because it does have a message going for it. And that is, a cruel surprise is just as good as a sweet surprise. And I feel like perhaps the overall message is don't overdo things. And it's very similar to Three's a Crowd, but you don't have that added layer of the husband from that story having like a bruised libido or just a tortured soul aspect going on for his character that ropes him into depression and thinking that his wife's having an affair on him with his former best friend or anything like that. There's none of that here. It's played up like a Scooby-Doo segment with like a haunted house angle with a killer with shears, and it's really dumb and silly. But the ending kind of makes up for it with that hubris. And I don't know. It kind of works. Yeah, it's predictable. It's kind of sluggish. It's kind of stupid, but I thought this was decent. I'd probably give this segment like a 3.25 out of 5 stars, which is the height of the segments for this movie. Now, the second segment, A Night on the Town, unfortunately, I thought this one was really dumb. I'd probably give this one like a 2.5 out of 5 stars. And to be honest, the actresses who played the 4 girls in this segment, while they're kind of good to look at, they're not really good at acting. Now, some might argue that the blonde girl that you might recognize from A Nightmare on Elm Street 3 was good, and maybe there are fans of her from that movie and like her here. I can get that, but they're really forgettable. And the whole plot set up with the girls looking for a night of fun, and they're getting into some trouble and actually find it. Yes, the moral is, if you're looking for trouble, you're going to find it, so you shouldn't look for trouble, I guess. But it's played up to the nth extreme here with the 3 dogs essentially trying to avenge, I guess, the death of their master and chasing these girls down the street for as long as they do. I just don't think that dogs do that. Like, it's played up so ridiculously, and there's no other cars on the road. And I don't know if that shows budget or maybe they filmed it on a set or whatever, but it doesn't even feel like a believable city. The whole segment is taken back by the lack of believability in its atmosphere and perhaps the ridiculousness of the concept and even how the climax is handled. It's just too over the top for my liking. But it wasn't terrible. I'd say this one is an okay segment at best, but a low one. Which brings me to the last segment, All Night Operator. Now, this one was more traditional in the thriller horror sense than the other two. I think this one was definitely, I guess, the scariest one if I had to say anything. But the problem is, this kind of feels like an unsolved mystery segment story and perhaps was rooted in real life. And I don't know if the story should have been as realistic as it was, but it did kind of work in that aspect to it. The only thing is, every plot beat that the story goes down with this mysterious caller, you see coming from a mile away. And some of this stuff we've seen done in way better movies in the thriller subgenre that kind of feel like full-length feature versions of this tale. But I'm going to say this, the acting performances were really good. I think the woman in the main star of this segment is actually one of the main actors of the CSI show. I forget her name. I want to say her name is Morg something. I could be butchering that. But she was really good in this. And I think her having a bum leg did add some tension. And to be honest, the tragedy of the story near the end, I think did kind of work, and the twist was very EC Comics Tales from the Cryptian, I should say. But yeah, it was just mostly decent all the way through. Nothing special. It was just, I guess, solid for what it was. I'd probably give it like a 3 out of 5 stars. As for the wraparound, I have no idea what the fuck happened here. The wraparound with the professor and where it ends up is just really fucking morbid, and I didn't like it. And the whole recontextualization of the entire movie could go fuck itself. I'd probably give the wraparound segment as a whole a 2 out of 5 stars. Even though I liked the concept of it, it just got butchered by the end. Which leads me to my thoughts on the movie. You know, Ken and Jim Wheat, I totally see the potential of the duo, at least back in the day. I don't know if they've done anything in modern times. I trust the potential for them to make solid movies. And I couldn't tell you the original script. I couldn't tell you maybe their actual thought process behind these segments in the film. I wish I had the Scream Factory release so I can hear the making of and maybe get some more insight on those things. But whatever happened to this movie shouldn't have happened. And I will say, you know, it as a movie in this subgenre, is it a must-watch? To be honest, and I hate to say this, but no. There's nothing in this movie that you can't get from somewhere else. Unless you're looking for some more Tales from the Crypt-like segments to kind of chew on if you're, you know, a mega fan of that franchise. Maybe give this a watch because they kind of feel like adjunct episodes to that show in some ways. But don't go out of your way to go buy this thing or anything. Stream it and make your mind up then. As for the reception of the movie, going back to what I said earlier on in this video, I can definitely see why people are mostly lukewarm on this movie, especially on places like Letterboxd and IMDb. I've seen some people say that this is one of the worst horror anthology movies ever made, and I say to you, no it isn't. Go watch fucking Creepshow 3 and come back to me. This is nowhere near that level of fucking atrocious, but it's also just hella mid in its execution. So I can totally see why this never got a continuation or became a franchise. And I could totally see why it didn't really perform well at the box office. And MGM has pretty much gave up on this movie years ago. I think this got an initial VHS release, and then once MGM started making DVDs once upon a time in the early 2000s, maybe the late 90s, this got an initial DVD release and never got re-released for years and was out of print until Scream Factory released the Blu-ray. Which should tell you that people just didn't give a shit about this movie, and it's obscure for a reason. Yeah, I've seen better straight-to-TV anthology films than this theatrical release. But that doesn't shortchange the fact that I still had fun with it in some aspects. I just wish it was way better. If I had to rate this movie from a 0 to 5 star basis as a whole, balancing out the segments and the wraparound, I'd probably give this film a solid 2.75 out of 5 stars, which is an okay. But like on the higher end, you know, this is a pushing decent movie. If the segments just had maybe a more running room, maybe a more polished nature to them, some more subtext to peel back. All three of these segments really had nothing to peel back here besides basic morality play, like your average Tales from the Crypt thing. But because they feel like Tales from the Crypt, I actually think that kind of helps it at the same time, because I love that show, even though finding episodes that I loved from that show, like outright, was kind of rare. But it still was enjoyable to watch nonetheless. And I can kind of see myself coming back to this movie if I was ever in the mood to watch it again. But I feel like since I've seen it, I'm good for a while. And I don't normally say that about anthology movies, and that's sad. But yeah, I'd pick this up in my physical collection if I saw it out in the wild. But I'm not going to go out of my way and buy it online for an exorbitant price because I'm a fan of it or anything. So yeah, that's my thoughts on After Midnight. Let me know down in the comment section, what is your thoughts on this movie? Until next time, take care.